I've reviewed a fair few Wolfenstein games by now. I've done Old Blood 2009 and Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Oddly though, I never got around to reviewing the one that reinvigorated the formula and gave it the kind of notoriety to become a series in the first place. That's right, I'll be looking at New Order! I'm kidding, I actually haven't even played New Order yet. I haven't played the OG Castle Wolfenstein either. Maybe one day, but in the meantime it's time to have a blast from the past and chain gun through mutants and bats because this is my review of Wolfenstein 3D. If Doom can be described as the father of what we would come to know as first-person shooters, Wolfenstein 3D is the grandfather. While it wasn't technically the first FPS, not even by id Software, it did do some things to elevate the genre. It was on foot, used real-world guns, and was set in a war that actually happened. In other words, war shooters like Call of Duty especially owe their existence to it. As was customary for such FPSs of the 90s, it was separated into levels. In Wolf 3D's case, different floors via elevators to serve as the end of each level. You start out with a shiv as your fallback weapon, which actually isn't entirely useless as normal enemies can be stun-locked and you can use it against the melee-centric dogs. Even so, you obviously don't want to have to be put in that kind of position. Your other three weapons operate on the same ammunition. Later versions would have additional weapons, but this review pertains to the PC version specifically. Specifically the base game as well as Spear of Destiny and its mission packs. In any case, your starting weapon is the pistol, which is okay for a while and can dish out more damage up close, but is obviously ineffective against anything higher than basic troops. Via a very handy secret in the first level or somewhere else down the road, you gain the machine gun. This is the one you'll be wanting to use the most because it's perfectly fine for most enemies. It has a decent rate of fire for stun locking while being light enough on ammo consumption. The chain gun is the BFG of this game, firing very rapidly and cutting through just about anything. It's also a complete ammo vampire, so you'd best save it for bosses and large crowds of enemies that the machine gun simply won't cut it with. Your enemies are of course patsy soldiers of various kinds for the most part. The basic trooper in brown carries basic pistols like your own. They don't seem like much, but can do a surprising amount of damage up close. The Double S, or Super Smurf as I like to call them for obvious reasons, attack with a machine gun. While you can stun lock them, you really don't want to face them with any less than a machine gun yourself. Officers are basically troopers, but they wear white and are super fast and aggressive. German Shepherds are melee and can be felled by any weapon, making the knife very viable. It's always a shame having to kill a dog, but at least the game doesn't try to guilt trip you for it, unlike a certain other game that released recently. Leroy's putting challenge aside, mutants are absolutely the bane of my existence. They use a rapid-fire pistol and seem to have a hairline reflex. Even if you know they're coming, it's really hard to get through without taking some damage. Bats also exist in the Spear of Destiny, but like all the enemies there are just a reskin, in their case of mutants, which means I hate them too. Luckily the game has some options for restoring your health when you inevitably get shredded. Meals restore your health by 10 points while medkits restore 25, a numeric health system that would later be used in Doom. There's also dog food that can restore 4 health points. If you're truly desperate and your health is lower than 12, you can actually drink blood to restore it by a point. In a sense of Soul Sphere before Soul Spheres even existed, the 1-up maxes your health to 100 as well as giving you 25 ammo and an extra life. And speaking of lives, you get a life system up to a maximum of 9. And you can rest assured that this isn't anything like Doom Eternal's life system. This is the old school kind where you still have to restart the level with your pistol upon death, and when your lives are expended in arcade fashion, it's game over. However, Wolfenstein 3D allows you to save whenever you want, even in the MS-DOS original, so it's effectively worthless unless you want a self-imposed challenge. Bosses tend to have a small set of variances, so I'll just lump them into categories. You've got Hans Gross, Trans Gross, and Gretel Gross, which are basically the exact same thing but with slightly different appearances. They all wield twin chain guns and are obviously best dealt with behind corners, preferably with your own chain gun. Uber Mutant likewise has a chain gun in his chest of fire. The cleaver's not actually doing anything. Dr. Shabs is somewhat unique. He throws his syringes at you. Uniquely, if you die to his syringes, BJ's HUD face becomes a mutant rather than the dead state. On the plus side, they're projectiles, so you can dodge them. Otto Giftmacher likewise has a rocket launcher whose projectiles can be evaded. Fithgazeke, the Barnacle Willem, the Death Knight, and Robot all dual-wield chain guns and missile launchers. The Fiota himself even shows up, again brandishing just 2 chain guns, but he also has power armor. This is accompanied by a Phase 2 where the armor is shedded and he's much faster but isn't too hard to bring down. The Angel of Death and Devil Incarnate are also bosses that are exclusive to the Spear of Destiny and its mission packs. They're surrounded by immortal ghosts that can only be disabled and fire shots at you. They're pretty much identical, but the Devil Incarnate does carry the uniqueness of being in an area covered in Doom textures. The level structure consists of 90-degree blocks along a tile system similar to other games like Catacombs 3D and later Nightmare 3D. Consequently, this means that levels can become quite repetitive and even easy to get yourself lost in. I would heavily recommend EC Wolf, which comes with a map. There are attempts made to differentiate some areas, but unlike Doom, it's fairly limited. Like Doom, however, secrets are aplenty, and the best way to find them is to wall hump. All the secrets operate on a push wall system, meaning that it needs clearance behind it in order to move. Wolf 3D also has a high score system, both for replenishing the aforementioned lives and for bragging rights. You mostly find treasure to add to your score, often in secrets. After you find the elevator in each level, like Doom after it also gives you a tally of your statistics. Naturally, you also find keys to open doors, but you can also occasionally trick guards in opening locked doors for you if you're lucky. Ultimately, it's a pretty fun game to play. It hasn't aged nearly as gracefully as Doom has, I think that's pretty clear. In terms of level design, enemy variety, and your own weapons, it can get repetitive pretty fast to where you catch on to the game's tricks like expecting enemies behind crevices. The Jaguar and later versions based off of it do add a flamethrower and rocket launcher, but this is my review of the PC original and it can wear out its welcome before too long. Still, it is pretty fun in small bursts. Naturally, the game takes place during that second global conflict where Blazkowicz is thrown in jail and the first episode revolves around him escaping the prison complex. After that, he must stop the mutant army in the second episode before going after the Fyoda himself in episode 3. The next 3 episodes after that are actually prequels where BJ must stop a general from unleashing a chemical warfare. The Spear of Destiny and its mission packs, as the name implies, revolve around him getting the Spear of Destiny from the Patsies. Kinda weird that it happens more than once and with the exact same ending sequence, but sure, at that point they just wanted an excuse for more levels, so it is what it is. Most of the story is told in the in-game manual, which you're free to read or not, but that's up to you. It really follows Carmack's philosophy at the time that story isn't super important. While it may be a bit shallow compared to later entries like Return to Castle Wolfenstein or Wolfenstein 2009, I will give it credit for at least not tripping over itself. As I mentioned in my Old Blood review, I personally think Machine Guns goes way too far in wrapping it up in melodrama and in one case politics to allow the gameplay to breathe. Wolf 3D's plot does exactly what it needs you to do, give you some kind of context for mowing down patsies. It does what it does if you aren't expecting it to be Shakespearean, and if you ask me, Wolfenstein is better off being action and cheesy anyway. While considered the grandfather of first-person shooters, it wasn't the first by a long shot. It isn't even the first of its kind with boots on the ground because id Software's own Catacomb 3D laid the groundwork for that. What Wolf 3D has going for it, however, is a far more complex color palette in addition to support for non-PC speaker sound effects, which also allows to have proper music. Guards even vocalize their alert and death sounds in German. Not mutants though, because mutants suck. While it lacks the floor and ceiling textures that Doom would later flaunt, there are decorative objects of various types to help keep it from getting too repetitive, at least for a time. They range from bones, both on the floors and in cages, to water wells, barrels, and pillars that block the player. Walls themselves have some decorative variants, such as flags, golden crests, eagle symbols, and portraits of the Fyoda himself. Naturally, lights and chandeliers can also adorn the ceilings, with attempts to represent bright spots below them. Enemy corpses also stick around, with the Fyoda's death actually surprisingly visceral. And just in case you weren't paying close enough attention, there's a kill cam just so you can admire the sight of him collapsing into a decapitated head atop organs and bones. Some of the bosses can actually have a decent amount of visual distinction too, with Submarine Willie looking like the TF2 soldier before the TF2 soldier was even a thing. The Spear of Destiny's mission packs come with graphic and audio changes for enemies, but sadly have the very ugly toy-looking guns in exchange. At least the Devil Incarnate sort of incorporates some Doom into the fight, so that's kinda neat. The Harbinger of Doom and Wolfenstein RPG would later much better carry on that connection, but it's still pretty nifty for its time. Wolfenstein 3D does technically have PC speaker support, but you really don't want to play it like that, and it's a mood issue nowadays anyway. Probably my favorite thing, cinematic-wise, is that it shows BJ running to freedom with his arms pumped at the ending of the first episode. Yeah! The game actually copies it at least once later on, which is kinda silly, but at least here it's pretty awesome. The music is quite nice to listen to, and overall some very iconic tracks. The main menu has the infamous March theme for what it's worth. Id was rightfully banking on the idea that whoever created the theme wasn't exactly going to be speaking up and demanding royalties. Another neat thing is that the enemies are actually directional, which, like with the HUD face, are staples that would later see a return to Doom. The game even has difficulty levels that subtly taunt the player if they pick the easiest difficulty. Don't worry, I won't shame you if you start out on Can I Play Daddy, after all, we all have to start somewhere. I see it as more the game encouraging you to build yourself up to be able to eventually take on the harder stuff rather than just trying to shame you, but that's just me. Ultimately, Wolfenstein 3D is an important evolutionary step in terms of presentation. You can tell it improves upon some things introduced in Catacomb 3D, and while Ultima Underworld was actually more sophisticated in some ways since it had floor and ceiling textures, Wolfenstein 3D was still a noticeable step forward. It was likely optimized around the idea of running fast on typical hardware available at the time, as Doom was, and the presentation was certainly a step in the right direction. Graphically and audibly, the presentation holds up a lot better than you may think. In many ways, Wolfenstein 3D isn't going to hold up as well as Doom. The rigid block-based design limited what they could do. The enemies are fairly limited to hit scan with one enemy, and occasionally bosses using projectiles. Even visuals tended to repeat quite a bit. Still, it should be commended for greatly improving the standards over Catacomb 3D and laying the groundwork for Doom and others to come. In a sense, calling Doom the father of first-person shooters and Wolfenstein 3D the grandfather is a bit fitting. Doom is the young enough guy that you can still have a lot of fun with, but Wolfenstein 3D is a little more aged and a little harder to get into the swing of things. Still, you have to commend the old-timer for all he's accomplished, because if it wasn't for him, the more fun and better-aged father wouldn't have been possible. I did devote the month of July to celebrating games that have had a big impact on the industry at large, and Wolfenstein 3D is definitely one of them. Also, EC Wolf at least makes the game easier to come back to with support for better mouse turning and a full-on auto map. If you're willing to overlook some repetition, it can be a fun game to play in small bursts just to see a very important step in first-person shooter history and perhaps the first to depict a real human war in the process. That's right, fans of Call of Duty and Battlefield, among others, especially owe it to themselves to give tribute to this great game. Of course, if you want a Wolfenstein that's much better aged, I recommend Return to Castle Wolfenstein, my favorite in the series so far. This has been my review of Wolfenstein 3D and Spear of Destiny. Thank you so much for tuning in with me, and I'll see you next time. If you really want to show your patriotism on this fine day, go pick up a chain gun and start mowing down some video game patsies.